Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the welcome. I'm going to have to make an apology up front because I have a super sore throat, but all the better that they are serving excellent cocktails in the bar. Thank you very much to the bartender for this first one, which is a black hole, and I can heartily recommend it for all sorts of purposes, not for solving the refugee crisis though, but any other purposes. So if I'm coughing a little bit, that's why. Anyway, let's get started. The refugees are coming. Not a day goes by without some kind of pictures, some kind of political statement about what to do or not to do about refugees. Many of you might have met them, either walking across the streets of Denmark, Europe, at some of the popular vacation spots, or in the train station of Copenhagen, or in the streets elsewhere. I mean, there can be little doubt. I mean, few other things seems to have preoccupied the political agenda this last year as this particular issue and those particular pictures. I mean, indeed, it seems like nothing else matters in Danish politics than refugees. And for that effort, very few solutions are actually coming. So what is the problem actually about, this proclaimed refugee crisis? Over the course of the next 40 minutes, I'm going to try to give you some basic facts, to answer some pretty simple questions about how many are they, where they're coming from, where they're going, what happens to them, to give a little bit of a sense of why we're having a refugee crisis, and perhaps most daringly, to propose some solutions. Because I don't think they're out of sight. This is a problem we can and should solve. So, to start with Europe, this is probably why this particular graph, the refugee crisis, has taken up so much space. If you look at this, you see the number of asylum seekers to Europe over the last, 10 years. Pretty low, pretty steady, small increase, and then a dramatic increase the last 2 years. And it is a dramatic increase. I mean, by any standards, from having somewhere around 400,000, 500, 600,000 asylum seekers for the entire EU, suddenly that number triples, or at least doubled from last year, to reach above 1 million. Some countries are, quite frankly, finding that very hard to cope with. Countries like Malta, Greece, Italy, even some rich countries like Sweden, which for all its liberal policy suddenly had to take a U-turn on many of these things as well. But if we look at the global numbers, this is actually still pretty small. It is a surprisingly small number of the world's refugees that ever reached Europe. This is the global stat. There are today more than 65 million people who've been forced to flee from their home. That includes about 21 million refugees. Those are the people, a small proportion of which you meet here or in other European countries. But almost twice as large is the group of internally displaced persons. They are kind of refugees in the commonsensical sense of the word, but they have still to leave their country. So they fled to somewhere else inside their country. If you look at Syria, for instance, well, there's about 5 million refugees, but there's 7 million internally displaced persons. Internally displaced persons are kind of refugees waiting to happen, because you only become a refugee by crossing an international border. And understandably, many of the 7 million internally displaced persons in Syria are looking to do exactly that, hoping to do exactly that. Half the world's refugees are children. Many of them have been forced to leave for various reasons without their parents, come unaccompanied. And this whole number here is rising, and it's rising fast. More than 12 million people got displaced just during the last year alone. Every minute, 20 more people are displaced. So, in fact, if we look at it and sort of understand the size of this, the vast majority of the world's refugees and IDPs never make it that far. That's perhaps understandable. We're talking about internally displaced persons. They are by definition stuck within their country of origin. But it also holds true for refugees as well. In fact, 86% of the world's refugees currently reside in low and middle income countries. It's pretty significant if you think about it in terms of the kind of countries that are then lifting the big burden, because it's not the countries who have the broadest shoulders. Just to take the Syrian example again, only 5 countries are hosting 95% of the world's refugees. Those countries are Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq. None of those are rich, high-income countries. They're all sort of low or high middle-income countries. If you look at countries like Lebanon, 1 in 5 is a refugee. In fact, if you sort of start looking at this in terms of per capita, those are the countries, in fact. If you look at it per capita, the dimension of this, or sort of inequality of who's doing what, becomes even starker. You have a country like Lebanon, who's the size of Denmark, or actually smaller geographically, also slightly smaller in terms of population size. 1.5, well, 1 out of 5 residing in Lebanon right now is a refugee. If you count the Palestinian refugees, that number's bumped up to then 1 in 3. That's a huge number that comes nowhere close to any European country. Then you've got Jordan, obviously sticking out. And you've got small states, tiny, tiny countries like Malta, right over here, or Nauru. Nauru is this tiny Pacific island state. Shouldn't have received any refugees. And it only does so because Australia entered into a highly criticized scheme to send them there instead of actually receiving anybody themselves. So this is the kind of situation. And in other words, and I think this is the first key message I want to leave you with tonight, this is not a European crisis. The kind of asylum seekers, refugees, the pictures that we tend to see every day in the television or hear about newspapers in policy discussions are at best a symptom of the real refugee crisis. And if there is a crisis, it's a crisis of our own making. The big and real refugee crisis, and there is a real refugee crisis, is happening elsewhere, in these countries. In these countries. And we need to lift up our gaze and see the problem for what it really is, instead of having a myopic vision, only looking within our own borders or at best into Europe. It's a very simple point, I know, but the vast majority of European policymakers simply don't seem to get it. So it's important for me that you do. So much for the stats and the intro here. The big question, of course, is how on earth did it get to this point? How does it get that bad? And this is just summarizing the previous numbers. And the answer is two-part. The kind of simple, banal explanation is the world is burning in more places. There are more conflicts, there are more political oppressions than there have been for a long time, and they produce refugees. Refugees flee for a variety of reasons, but none of them so important as war and armed conflict. This is the major driver today of refugeehood. If we take again the Syrian case, the civil war in Syria has, in a few years, created the biggest single refugee flow in the world, or group. Almost 5 million. Actually, we don't exactly know the number. These are the registered numbers. They tend to be lower because many people never get registered. And if those 5 million weren't enough, as said, on top of that, you have to put 7 million who are fled their homes in Syria, but still haven't exited the country, fled to some other part, many of whom, very understandably, are looking to do so. That's the war we know. We all heard about the conflict in Syria. But to understand the bigger number, the 65, we have to understand that there are a number of major refugee-producing conflicts we tend never to hear about, perhaps because the majority of the refugees from those conflicts don't end up in Denmark or in Europe or anywhere close to here. Those would be countries like the Central African Republic, South Sudan, or Yemen. Yemen, did you know that Yemen, the conflict there displaced 2.5 million people just last year? Similarly, if we look at sort of internally displaced persons, the big group, it's very clear that you have levels of violence in many places that far exceeds anything we can fathom in Europe. Look at countries in Central America like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, displacing millions of people. The Nobel Peace Prize, I don't know if you heard, just got granted to Colombia for ending the world's longest-standing civil conflict, which is great news for displaced people, because there's 6 million of them that have been displaced during the civil war there. Unfortunately, however, that kind of news doesn't come around very often. Conflicts tend to last longer, and they tend to produce more refugees. And quite frankly, we have a pretty bad track record in terms of solving them. I think the last 25 years of interventionist policies, of military interventions in various countries have proved one thing. It's, yes, we can depose of a dictator. No, we have no clue what's coming afterwards. More often than not, it's more refugees, not fewer. Wars, of course, are not the only reason. Across the world, we have more or less oppressive governments, and very often ethnic, religious, or other minorities become the scapegoat from larger political struggles. Like these ones, Christians in Iraq. For more than 1,000 years, the Middle East has been home to numerous religious minorities, Christians, Gnostic, ancient religions, all sorts of things, living side by side. But the last 5 years have largely decimated those populations. This is a very unfortunate side consequence of the Arab Spring, of the conflict in Iraq. And with the onset of ISIS, we see that they're indeed mobilizing against these religious minorities, forcing them to convert or publicly executing religious minorities. Similarly, we see that homophobia is on the rise in many countries, especially countries like Uganda, where mobilizing domestic populations against, in this case, a sexual minority, has become a political tool not only to gather internal political capital, but also to sort of strike back against the entire international aid, human rights community of do-gooders trying to claim sovereignty. Very much like a number of Western countries have tried to reclaim sovereignty by refusing to live up to their obligations in terms of refugees. And then there are, of course, the more traditional causes that often leads to different ethnic minorities getting squeezed for various reasons, like these, the Rohingyas in Myanmar, for very, very long denied even the most basic rights in the country, no access to citizenship, subjected to all sorts of discrimination. The last years, more than 100,000 have fled in ramshackle boats, trying to escape the country, only to become pawns at the mercy of the surrounding states, trying to push them back and forth as if they were pieces on a chessboard. Many of them dying at sea, and with a desperate look in their eyes as here. And last but not least, there's, of course, climate changes. To be quite frank, we don't know what climate change means in terms of refugees. It's very clear that there can be a connection, and that there is in a number of cases. Over the last 10, 15 years, we've come to reinterpret a lot of refugee-producing conflicts as having climate-related reasons underneath, typically involving scarcity of resources that make particular groups the scapegoat. Syria is a case in point. At least some people point to the fact that droughts, lack of water, for a number of years from 2006 onwards, led to urbanization, which was part of the social unrest that mobilized in advance of the civil war. But it's very hard to say. Quite frankly, we don't know all the steps in the equation yet. There is a potential, but not necessary, link between the two. You find situations where countries are facing extreme scarcity of resources, are subjected to huge natural hazards, and it doesn't affect specific populations like this. On the contrary, it makes things come together. And you see the exact opposite. But all of this, these sort of main drivers in terms of the push effect for why we have faced with more refugees than ever before in modern history, is only one part of the story. The other and equally important part is that refugees have fewer and fewer places to flee to. And this is just as important. Being a refugee was always intended to be something temporary. It's a holding place to be a refugee until a proper solution can be found. Either you go back, the situation changes in the country where you come from, you find some kind of local integration in the country you're in, or you move on to another country that agrees to receive you and provide you with some kind of safety. But more and more refugees are stuck in this temporary position indefinitely. With both second and third generation refugees living in camps with no prospects of moving anywhere. Why is that? Well, for one, as mentioned before, conflicts tend to last longer. That means that people can't be expected to return within a short span of years. But people cannot move on either. What's happened over the last 25 years is that developed states like Europe, North American states, Australia, have developed more and more sophisticated ways to block refugees' access to asylum, or even block them from moving anywhere in the first place. This involves a whole range of more or less sophisticated mechanisms, like moving migration control to international waters or foreign waters where it is claimed that the right to seek asylum does not apply. Or this, basically making airline companies, private security firms, all sorts of private contractors responsible for carrying out border control, elaborate passport checks. You've all been subjected to this. Even when traveling within Europe, there's always going to be this training. Indeed, I mean, to sit on Turkish Airlines and just check in people, you have to go through 3 months at least of rigorous migration control training. Or places like this, making deals with countries to have them host refugees instead of you. I was going to have another picture, actually. Oh, something missed. My bad. What we see is that more and more countries try and pay their way from receiving refugees. So Australia, for example, struck a deal with countries like Papua New Guinea, Nauru, that we spoke about before, to divert refugees there instead of receiving them themselves. Europe, in a quite similar vein, tried to resolve the bigger problem of hosting refugees by striking a deal with the country, the very country that hosts the largest number of refugees in the world, that they should receive refugees back from Europe. Arbitrarily, there has to be a concomitant obligation for other European states to receive them, but to basically block the massive or major route into Europe from Turkey towards Greece. 7 billion euro was the price tag for that deal. And the consequences are quite clear because it's pushing more and more people to take more dangerous routes. So since the 1990s, the primary, some would say the only real response of European and other wealthy states to refugees has been to build taller walls and strike more dirty deals with countries to keep them away. So what we're seeing is kind of a Pincer dynamic, if you look at it. Refugees are pushed from both sides. They're unable to move forwards, unable to move back, and the result is kind of a pressure cooker, both in terms of the refugees themselves and in terms of the major refugee hosting countries who are getting squeezed to receive more and more refugees. Today, as I said earlier, 86% of the world's refugees are in low and middle income countries. 20 years ago, it was 70%. So these policies have had a huge impact in that respect. And the consequences of this situation are, quite frankly, devastating. Local countries like Lebanon, Jordan, they cannot be expected to absorb millions of refugees, give them citizenship or integrate them. Hence, they tend to leave refugees in permanent limbo, dependent on international aid, and resigned to live in camps. Hence the picture here. Like this Satari refugee camp in Jordan. Oop, here we are. This is not a permanent livelihood. Yet refugee camps like this one, or the famous Dadaab camp in Kenya, start developing into cities in their own right, tent cities. Dadaab currently hosts 80,000 refugees. Satari in Jordan. More worrying yet, there's no concomitant commitment of the rich countries to foot the bill of the million of refugees dependent on aid in these countries. For years, international aid organizations like the UNHCR, the World Food Programme, have been chronically underfunded in terms of their estimated needs to provide just basic things for refugees in these situations. Things like tents, daily or weekly food supplies, basic needs, nothing fancy. And yet, there is not money for it. So, this is what is pushing major refugee hosting countries to the breaking point. Not only are they left to shoulder the vast majority of the world's refugees, they're not even getting compensated in financial terms. And all these things create an understandable drive among refugees to take what would, for any normal person, be an intolerable risk in terms of putting yourself in a boat, risking your lives, paying money that you don't have to a human smuggler in order to reach safety. Indeed, a lot of analysts link the kind of big arrival numbers that we saw last summer of 2015, and the end of that year in Europe, as being directly related to lack of opportunities in countries of origin, lack of education for their children, and most directly, a big cut in funding during the spring of 2015 for the aid organizations. No longer able to cope, they had to reduce their food rations and aid rations by 50%. Boom, and then this happens. And this is what pushes people to board these kind of overcrowded and unseaworthy boats like this one, which was spotted off the coast of Egypt some month ago, carrying more than 500 people. It's a boat that capsized, leaving about 200 to drown. This is just to zoom in. And the statistics in terms of refugees dying, both in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, are quite staggering. If you look at this, over the last 15 years, more than 30,000 registered deaths have been reported, mainly in the Mediterranean and North African regions. That's probably not even the real number. many deaths go unreported, neither the family nor any authorities knowing what happened. And if you look at it globally, I mean, there's a lot of dangerous migration routes in the world. I mean, it's no fun to cross from Mexico into the United States in the desert. It's certainly no fun to cross the Gulf of Aden from Somalia to Yemen, which is another popular route, or from Southeast Asia to try and reach Australia. But all these different routes, still, the Mediterranean, if you look at the reported death for this year alone, which by all accounts will be the most deadly year for migrants ever recorded, almost 3/3 relate to the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, there's a very direct relation between shutting down some of the easy and safer routes, like the route from Turkey to Greece. And historically, we see that that will divert the pressure to more dangerous routes. And we have seen a spike in the central Mediterranean route for this year as well. So this crisis, and this is my second point this evening, is a crisis of own making. Refugee experts, like myself, aid organizations, have been warning about this crisis for years, that countries hosting refugees could not keep up, that refugees could not be expected to live in camp-like situations forever, and now it's happening. And that is what we are seeing. The good news, if there is any good news, is that state leaders are slowly, but still clearly, realizing that the current system is broken. The deterrence paradigm that has guided Europe and other rich states in terms of trying to minimize their own responsibility is clearly not sustainable. It doesn't matter what kind of lens you apply to the analysis. It leaves refugees in indefinite encampment and dependency on aid. It creates uncontrolled, irregular migration flows. It feeds a growing transnational, illicit migration industry of human smuggling. And it's unfair to the point of absurdity in terms of the expectations placed upon countries in the region of origin and the burden they are left to bear. So what we're standing in right now is perhaps best characterized as a crisis in terms of the policy paradigm that has been guiding refugee policy, the kind of don't look, it's probably going to get better approach that a lot of Western states have been applying to this problem. And what do you do in a paradigm crisis? Well, you call the UN. 3 weeks ago, the world's first high-level UN summit to deal with refugees and migration was held in New York. So this is Ban Ki-moon, Obama, and Mogens Lykketoft, the Danish, at that time still chairman of the General Assembly. So this meeting was prompted directly by the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, who, in a very, very bold attempt to change the system, sent out an analysis paper calling for political support to a kind of new deal for refugees, a deal that would involve a commitment to resettle, that the richest states would resettle at least 10% of the world's refugees annually, to simply try and create some kind of escape valve for those increasing number of refugees stuck in limbo. And as unfortunately is often the case with UN summits, it didn't go exactly as planned. The ambition was to craft two what they call global compacts, which are these sort of grand political deals, one for refugees, one for migrants. Sorry, I'm going to have another sip of this. It is good stuff. And after months of preparation, and I was heavily involved in this, like many, many other academics, on-the-ground experts, practitioners, trying to go to Europe, to New York, and to Istanbul, other places where high-level meetings were being held, and so I'm saying, how can we feed into this process? How can we support it? What is actually needed at the different levels? And I think the only ones that really thought of this as a success were the kind of states that had done everything in their power to undermine the process from the get-go, because they did not want to take on more refugees. They actively worked against any kind of text in the final agreement that would have any kind of specific requirement in terms of how many people they would need to deal with or how much money they would have to fork out in order to make this system work. And so what we were left with was essentially a completely watered down text. It has no mention of any specific obligations. It has abstract formulations on solidarity, which, I mean, this is not the first refugee crisis we've had in the last 50 years. What we know is that abstract formulations of solidarity do not work, do not lead to any actual change on the ground. Even worse, it deferred the whole idea of having a global compact, a global agreement, for 2 years. That's a pretty high-stake game to play, knowing just how much things have changed the last 2 years. And to think that there'll be more political will in 2 years than there is now is, yeah, maybe a little naive. And there's no roadmap in terms of how those compacts will be secured. Hence, I'm quite frankly not optimistic that this will work. What I am, however, optimistic about is that there are solutions. And so for this last 10 minutes of my talk, I will be trying to set out what I think could be a viable alternative to the current paradigm. It's an alternative that I set out in a book that's going to come out next month. It's called How to Solve the Refugee Crisis. I'm really sorry it's in Danish, but I hope you will buy it and read it if you want to know more. It's only going to cost 50 kroner, so at least that part is good, and it's only 50 pages. Yeah. It's basically going to be quicker reading that than hearing my talk, so yeah. No, but in that book, I try and do what quite few academics, to be honest, like to do, and is get my hands dirty and try and set out some kind of concrete alternative. It's very easy as an expert to simply get stuck in criticism mode and sort of go on about this or that political solution not being in conformity with international law, conventions, EU law, domestic law, or having poor effects for refugees. It's another thing entirely, I think, to take the responsibility of trying to engage in a discussion of how could things actually work on a more practical level. And this is not self-adoration, it's just a general call that if what we're seeing is that the entire political system is getting it wrong, if we're seeing the political discussion getting derailed, I think more voices need to be there in terms of getting into that kind of thinking, which is often full of dilemmas. And quite frankly, there are no easy solutions to refugee policy. If there'd been easy solutions, we've done that many, many years ago. It's full of dilemmas about who's doing what rights versus how many, economics, politics, legal entitlements. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage, and doesn't mean that we can't do it. So in this book, I'm trying to say that it doesn't have to be this way. We can easily imagine alternatives. It's not a natural law that refugees have to travel hundreds of miles, risking their lives in the Mediterranean and paying thousands of euros that they do not have to migrant smugglers in order to find safety. And it's not a natural law that a small handful of countries have to shoulder the vast majority of refugees instead of getting more countries involved. And last but not least, it's not a natural law that refugees are an economic burden as opposed to a resource, and indeed resourceful in terms of contributing both to their own self-reliance but also to their host communities. How to do that? Well, the thing is, a lot of the tools are actually already there, and things are happening in terms of those reforms. We just need to get them upscaled. The first one is about getting to safety. There are various mechanisms for getting refugees from A to B without this completely haphazard, extremely risky, dangerous, illegal way of going about paying people to circumvent borders. It's something called resettlements, which is basically quota systems. Denmark used to operate that. We stopped it this year. This was the major push of this whole UN meeting, and yet Denmark pulled the other way instead of moving forward. If we can get more countries to commit to resettlement quotas, we provide a safe way, we provide a way where hosting countries like Denmark can prepare in advance. They know full well how many will come. They might even go and help choose who comes. Have security vetting procedure if that's what you're worried about. That's no problem. You can do all of these things. And we have been doing that for many, many years, but just on a minuscule scale. Resettlement is furthermore a hugely important tool if we want countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey to keep on hosting the big numbers. There's no way that they're going to commit to this if there's no other sort of exit point for the refugees that they're currently receiving, if they only see the numbers rising. You have other options. You could, if you don't want to resettle them and have quotas and go through that whole system, you can issue humanitarian visas. Very simple mechanism, already provided for in current EU law. So this is something that was used historically. You issued humanitarian visas as a safe way of letting people organize a legal trip. Right now, the going cost of getting from Syria to Denmark is somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 euro. A commercial airline flight from, say, a neighboring country like Turkey costs a few hundred euro. Let them fly. Let them take on this, especially for groups of refugees where we know they have a right to protection. Or Denmark actually, historically, operated a quite innovative concept where you could submit your asylum application at embassies in neighboring countries to the country you fled to. So no need to go again through this whole ordeal and the many risks and pay all this money. No, you could actually submit an application and the Danish authorities would look at it in good, calm and order in order to decide whether a person would be able to come here or not. And there are multiple ways. I mean, I can already imagine you saying, well, wouldn't that create a huge pull factor, etc.? No, there are various ways of organizing this in a manner that doesn't mean the system gets overwhelmed. It doesn't have to be accessible to absolutely everybody. You can have different criteria based on need, association, attachment, etc. So, if the first thing is getting there, the second thing to this equation, in my mind, is some kind of meaningful burden sharing or international solidarity. Not just of money, but also in terms of where refugees are being hosted. You can think about this in different ways. You could have the kind of perfect distribution system, kind of a quota globally for refugees based on whatever criteria you want in terms of population size, country size, GDP, existing number of refugees, unemployment, whatsoever. We've tried that on a small scale in Europe. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. And there's nothing to say that it would work on a global scale either. But there again, there are other ways. What we could imagine is kind of a temporal commitment of different kinds of states. It's quite natural in a refugee situation that refugees would immediately go to neighboring countries. And indeed, in many cases, they would prefer to. What happens, though, is that after a number of years, without access to education, to labor, to any kind of prospect of going back, their needs change. So it would make sense to have a strong resettlement component at that certain moment in time. And to use that, again, as a political leverage with the big refugee countries to sort of get a balanced system, of course, in combination with economic aid to support their big role in hosting refugees. And that brings me to the third part of the... Oh, that's excellent. That brings me to my third and final point. We need to seriously rethink how we consider and conceive of refugee assistance, refugee protection. If you look only at the legal side of things, you'll find that there's a Bill of Rights with sort of different rights set out in instruments like the Refugee Convention. And it's a very good starting point. I'm not saying let's draft a new convention. I don't think there's a need to be honest. What I am saying is that we've created a system, a humongous system of international aid with billions of dollars and euros going into essentially warehousing refugees for an indefinite amount of time. That does nothing good. It's not good for the refugees, it's not good for the host communities, and it's certainly not good for their prospects of ever exiting a refugee existence. The good news is that a lot of things are happening, again on the small scale. A number of actors are being more dynamic, sort of thinking forward about this. Danish Refugee Council is actually one of them. Another one is Jordan as a project country. In Jordan, what's happened the last few years is that they've brokered a whole new system. Some of my colleagues came up with a brilliant proposal that, well, if you want Jordan to open their labor market, you need to create the jobs. It's a simple truth. I mean, they can't be expected, already huge economic deficit, to open up their labor market. What they could, however, do is to create jobs, or if the international community could help create jobs, that would benefit both local Jordanese and refugees. So based on this research proposal, Jordan and the European Union negotiated a deal allowing special economic zones to work as hubs for creating employment possibilities for refugees, in exchange for EU lifting taxes, import restrictions of different kinds, and to actively pursue investment in these very zones. These are programs that could be upscaled in terms of actively supporting European companies to invest in creating jobs in the major refugee hosting countries. Other countries have taken it even further, like Uganda, which, unlike pretty much all other developing countries, have actually taken the breathtaking decision of opening up their labor market completely to refugees. Despite being the third largest refugee hosting country in Africa, they allow refugees to work completely freely and to move and establish themselves wherever they want. And the results are overwhelmingly positive. It turns out that many, many refugees are completely self-reliant, pursue various jobs and opportunities. Especially in the cities, a huge proportion of refugees have their own business. On top of that, more than 20% of refugee business owners actually employ other people, not just refugees, but also local Ugandans. So suddenly you have situations where refugees help create jobs, not just for themselves, but actually for local populations. And I could go on. And that point, in a sense, also extends to how we receive refugees here. The last 10 years, or even longer, Denmark has done pretty much everything to make it difficult to be a refugee and asylum seeker, at least an asylum seeker in Denmark, forcing them to not be able to work in the asylum centers, to live in tents, to not get family unification. There are a few pilot initiatives coming out now that are trying to change that. What I'm arguing for is a complete overhaul and reform. There's a number of studies showing that with the aging populations and with the kind of understanding of how refugees operate, you can do huge things in terms of pushing refugee access. That also goes for how refugees connect to local communities. Another colleague of mine has recently proposed that you should match refugee skill sets and desires in terms of where they want to go, which municipality they should stay at, with those municipalities, their desires, their need. Studies again show that it may be a much more effective way of getting them into the labor market, because they'd go places where they might have better social networks, where there might be more need for the particular skills that they possess. Same could be done internationally in terms of language, other culture-specific issues. Or, as a project that I'm currently involved in myself, studies show that the same refugees fare completely different when it comes to labor market integration, depending on which countries they go to. We have a tendency to talk about bad refugees, good refugees, in terms of whether they're quick to adapt to the labor market or whether many are unemployed. But if those same people fare so differently depending on which country they arrive to, it should make us look inward in terms of thinking about how can we design our reception systems in a better way. One of the major drivers turned out to be that Somalis going to the US, for example, very, very quick to set up their own businesses, exactly like in Uganda. Whereas in Scandinavian countries, that stuff is difficult for all sorts of reasons. But there's nothing to say that we cannot challenge that. Mentorship agreements, deals with local authorities to waive and make it easier to establish yourself, and, importantly, loaning opportunities. Anything from crowdfunding to microloans to refugees who want to kickstart. Because studies show that for every day after you arrive here, that you don't get active either through education, labor, volunteer work, that directly relates to what your outcome is 10 years later. So on that note, I'm going to conclude my presentation. I think the refugee crisis is entirely solvable. If you look at the global population of refugees, well, it's a big number, but it's still only 0.03% of the world's population. If we look at the funding currently provided to international aid organizations to help refugees, it's less than what the United States spent on food during this year's Thanksgiving Day. Independence Day, sorry. I mean, this is not out of reach, but if we don't deal properly, if we don't find solutions that actually deal with the problem as opposed to the symptoms and maybe just our own identity politics, it will get worse. Just to wind off, I don't know why it's not doing this. I'm going to do it like this. That was the last slide. Just to say, I've been talking for exactly 45 minutes, and in the course of that, 1,080 people have been displaced. So this is a pretty acute issue, and I hope that you feel more informed about it. Thank you very much.